The name Hamburg appears a few lines above as Hamburg Planista, as well as twice reversed in the general vicinity. Not only is this text completely hidden within and overwhelmed by the sea of signs, it is also impossible to see without substantial magnification. Surprisingly absent among the names in this hidden signature of sorts is that of Austin Henry Layard, who has been credited with the execution of the lithograph, and who in his book of 1849, The Monuments of Nineveh, where the lithograph appeared, explained the archaeological evidence behind it.
I am here tonight to introduce our guest speaker for this Master Series event, Ada Cohen. Ada is a professor of art history and the Israel Evans Professor in Oratory and Belles Lettres at Dartmouth College. She received her BA from Brandeis University and her MA and PhD degrees from Harvard University. Her research has focused on the era of Alexander the Great in antiquity and the impact of Alexander's imagery. She has also worked on topics in Near Eastern and prehistoric art, sexuality and the construction of pictorial identity, travel and landscape, as well as the depiction of childhood and the family in ancient art, and co-authored Inside an Ancient Assyrian Palace, looking at the Austin Henry Layard reconstruction. This brings me to this evening's talk, which is relevant to WAM because we have in our collection an Assyrian relief from the palace of Ashur-Narsipal II. It is on permanent display in the Renaissance Court, and Professor Cohen will contextualize it within this 9th century BCE palace at Nimrud in modern-day Iraq. 5 years ago, this stone relief underwent an extensive conservation treatment by the Andrew W. Mellon Fellow in Objects Conservation, Carrie Dodson. Some of you may remember Carrie working in the gallery for many months, cleaning the surface of this masterwork. But without further ado, Professor Cohen, welcome.
As you enter the beautiful Renaissance court of the Worcester Art Museum for the first time, you are likely to bypass the Assyrian relief that is the focus of my presentation today. Securely attached to the wall of the portico on your right, it appears as a truly exotic presence, alone in an environment structured around an impressive set of Roman mosaics from near Antioch in Syria. In the first half of the 9th century BCE, when this relief was made, it would have been part of an expansive environment of its own, the so-called Northwest Palace of King Ashur-Narsipal II at the site of Nimrud, ancient Kalhu, in modern-day Iraq. Nimrud lies 18 miles southeast of Mosul, a city that is much in the news today. The ancient city, Kalhu, was surrounded by a mud brick wall and covered almost 900 acres along the river Tigris. A fortified citadel of around 50 acres with temples, public buildings, and other monuments dominated this urban landscape. And so here is the palace, and over there. Completed around 860 BCE, Ashur-Narsipal's palace was made largely out of mud brick. But the lower sections of the interior walls were lined with large alabaster or gypsum slabs of variable quality, about 8 feet high and 1 foot thick. They were set in bitumen and then secured with clamps and dowels. They were installed not only to protect and reinforce the mud brick walls, but also to provide a durable surface for relief decoration. The Worcester relief portrays a type of figure that was ubiquitous in Ashur-Narsipal's palace, a minor deity that Assyrian texts call Apkallu, and that today is typically referred to as a genie, an imperfect term that points to our incomplete understanding of its precise identity and function. Its supernatural associations are made clear by its two wings, and the divine associations are underscored by the horned headdress, which you can see over here, which was a long-standing symbol of divinity in the ancient Near East. Stiff and upright, the Apkallu is shown in a twisted perspective that combines profile and frontal views, a style commonly employed in ancient Near Eastern as well as Egyptian reliefs and paintings. This is perhaps more strikingly evident on the Apkallu's profile face, which features, as you can see, a frontal eye. In addition to its horned headdress and the richly detailed wings, the figure sports a highly stylized beard and a long tunic that opens to reveal one leg. The use of deep incision and relief line to detail the musculature of the leg, however abstractly, conveys great strength and power. The Apkallu's fearsome nature is enhanced by the daggers it carries in its waistband. Majestic and dignified, this type of figure would have participated in ritual activity as indicated by the bucket or pail he holds with his left hand and the pine cone-shaped object he holds with his upraised right. The gesture he performs with a pine cone and the relation between pine cone and pail have been the subject of much debate. Assyrian texts refer to the pail as bandudu, while the pine cone is generally understood to be an Assyrian mulilu, or purifying device. The gesture is typically directed toward King Ashurnasirpal or toward a stylized tree. To give you an idea of what such arrangements look like, let me show you a view of a group of Assyrian reliefs owned by my own institution, Dartmouth College. Here, at their most recent location in the Hood Museum of Art, and now in storage, waiting for the museum's expansion and eventual reopening, which should be fairly soon. On this relief at Dartmouth, Ashurnasirpal is clearly identified by his fez-like hat. He wears a long robe, a bullet-shaped earring, and wedge-heeled sandals, and he holds a bow and arrows. His beard is stylized similarly to the genie's behind him, and he is the clear recipient of the genie's attention. This relief at Dartmouth and another at Amherst College shows the genie's ritual gesture extended toward a stylized tree, only one half of which is preserved, while another half appears on the other side. A relief in the British Museum enlarges our understanding of the ceremony by showing both the use of the pine cone and a complete tree. Here, Ashurnasirpal makes two appearances in near symmetrical duplication, though one figure may represent an ancestor. The ritual is supervised by the god Ashur, who emerges in miniature from a winged disc. Each version of the king is attended to by an Apkallu similar to the one at Worcester. This particular relief on the screen was located in Ashurnasirpal's throne room in the Northwest Palace. It was placed behind the throne. This is the throne, and this is it. As this image shows, a digital reconstruction by Learning Sites, a company that has invested a lot of scholarly research on reconstruction. I will say a bit more about this room later. As for the tree that is the focus of attention in this and other reliefs, it is typically rendered with a central trunk and radiating branches ending in palmettes. Many scholars identify it as a date palm and the enigmatic cone as the male flower of the date palm used to fertilize female plants. If so, the ritual activity may encode the fertilization of the land more widely, or it may evoke a sense of purification or magical protection and blessing more abstractly. Whatever the case, it is clear that we are dealing with a very formal and solemn type of activity with religious implications. The apkalus may generally communicate the idea that the person or feature they direct their attention to is divinely sanctioned or inspired, and more specifically that the agricultural fertility of the land lies in the hands of the gods and of the king. Some scholars imaginatively find the shape of the tree to evoke irrigation canals. There is one other type of apkalu that was shown tending a tree, the bird-headed. I show you a good example from the Northwest Palace today in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. The rituals in which such apkalu participate are also represented in miniature among the figural incisions that decorate the clothes of significant figures like the king on some of the most impressively executed reliefs. Take as an example the garment covering the shoulder of Ashurnasirpal on the relief at Dartmouth, here in a 19th century rendering. Not only do we see antithetical bird-headed apkalu tending the tree, we also see the king himself in symmetrical duplication, doing the same below. In addition to other vegetal and animal embellishments, composite beings, and even animal attacks. Among other areas, the hem of the gown of Ashurnasirpal at Dartmouth is also lightly incised with various designs, including representations of the king in the company of human-headed apkalu. Returning now to the large tree in relief, I must mention that they are also frequently found alone in the corners of rooms where they may have served in a protective capacity or more prosaically acted as space fillers. Indeed, the tree's varied placement in the palace and its multiple associations with the genies and the king suggest that it may have had more than one meaning. It may have stood for the abstract concept of fertility in general, but could also be associated with certain divinities, such as the goddess Ishtar. Allusions to that goddess have also been discerned in the rosettes in the bracelets worn by the king and genies in ceremonial scenes, as you can see here at Worcester. Such wristbands with rosettes are ubiquitous on the reliefs, but there are subtle differences in their rendering. Although the differences may have been meaningful, they may also be attributed to the considerable number of sculptors engaged in the carving over a long period of time and other circumstantial factors. I hope it is clear by now that the Worcester figure, though alone today, would have had plenty of company in its original context. Figures of the king as well as other apkalu just like it. At first glance, all the human-headed apkalu from the Northwest Palace look distinctly similar in size, material, and style. Upon closer inspection, however, one discerns small differences in dress and physical attributes, as well as in the bodily proportions and the design of certain decorative details, again pointing to the work of several sculptors. The quality of the stone and the execution also varies. The variability among the figures helps scholars reconstruct the placement of the slabs in their original architectural context. Also helpful in this regard is a band of cuneiform script known as the standard inscription, which is carved across virtually all of the slabs with subtle variations in arrangement. At Worcester, it is arranged in 20 lines. It was first written on the stone by a scribe and then carved by a stone carver as the final touch on the slabs. It served to unify the scenes as well as to proclaim in writing the same message conveyed by the reliefs, Ashurnasirpal's power, piety, and efficiency. Inscriptions were very common in Assyrian art. Frontal, stiff, and symmetrical, Ashurnasirpal's famous statue in the British Museum, taken from the temple of Ishtar at Nimrud, features an inscription on his chest announcing his titles and conquests in a manner reminiscent of the standard inscription on the relief at Worcester and others like it. Collectively, these and other texts speak of Ashurnasirpal's military victories in the east and the west, his unabashedly cruel treatment of his enemies, including civilian populations and the young, the acquisition of tribute and loot, but as I said, also his piety, his legal decrees, and his just rule over his own people. In text, his so-called annals, Ashurnasirpal is called, quote, attentive prince, worshipper of the great gods, ferocious dragon, conqueror of cities and the entire highlands, king of lords, encircler of the obstinate, crowned with splendor, fearless in battle, lofty and merciless hero, end quote. Using rhetorical strategies that have begun to sound surprisingly familiar to our own ears in 2018, he even exclaims in the first person, quote, I am king, I am lord, I am praiseworthy, I am exalted, I am important, I am magnificent, I am foremost, I am hero, I am a warrior, I am a lion, and I'm virile, end quote. In images, virility is communicated by the lovingly detailed rendering of hair. Notice the elaborate curls on the statue, each one kept in its proper place as if by copious amounts of styling product. Rich beards in particular are a hallmark of this art, which is dominated by, shall we say, manly men. An amusing letter from a second millennium Near Eastern ruler to his irresponsible son underscores the deep roots of this tradition. The father asks his son rhetorically, quote, how long will we have to guide you? Are you still young? Are you not a man? Is there no beard on your chin? How much longer will you fail to administer your own house? End quote. Ashurnasirpal's stylists would surely approve of a recent study from the universities of Glasgow and St. Andrews in Scotland that claims to have proven scientifically on evolutionary terms the beard's masculine allure. When, upon discovery in the 19th century, Assyrian art became a source of fascination for educated Europeans, the emphasis on the beard was clearly noticed. The French painter Gustave Courbet, who despised the artistic status quo of his own times but was impressed by Assyrian art, used Assyrian beards as inspiration in his autobiographical painting of 1854 titled The Meeting. And this is him. He had seen sculptures from French excavations at the site of Khorsabad brought to the Louvre Museum and was struck by the impression that his own profile resembled those on Assyrian sculpture. All that said, beardless men also appear in the walls of Ashurnasirpal's palace where they attend to the king. On this relief at the Metropolitan Museum, two such figures appear, one helping the king make a libation. The lack of beard of these attendants and their slightly puffy faces have identified them as eunuchs. Their job is to carry the paraphernalia of the king as well as keep him comfortable with their fly whisks. Eunuchs were featured extensively on the palace reliefs, and their proximity to the king also speaks to their influential role in the Assyrian administration. We know that many were literate, a noteworthy quality at a time when even royalty was generally untrained in reading and writing. Their conspicuous presence suggests the high level of trust that they commanded, just as the near complete absence of women may be taken to suggest their public invisibility. The eunuch's association with a king brings them to the company of Apkallu as well, at least in some rooms, as you can see on the screen. The room in which the Worcester relief was located, room N, was overwhelmingly populated with genies and trees. The king appears there only once, flanked by 2 genies. The Worcester genie was placed at the entrance to the room, gesturing with the pine cone toward anyone stepping inside, while moving away from room G, an important audience or ritual hall. This drawing helps us conjure up the sense of repetition that was so important to the original display. And here is N19, this is the one in the museum here. If we use our imagination, we may concede that the current display of N19, despite its loneliness, unintentionally conjures up something of the original effect, framed as the Apkallu is by one of the arches of the Renaissance court. Arched gateways were a staple of the Northwest Palace's architecture, as you can see from this reconstruction of the palace's main courtyard. Today, we no longer readily subscribe to the traditions of empathy and animism that accompanied the viewing of sculptures in the late 19th century and early 20th century. It was in the early 20th century that the Victorian poet Thomas Hardy, in his Christmas in the Elgin Room, gave voice to the Elgin marbles taken from the Athenian Acropolis here in their current display in the Duveen Gallery in the British Museum. Hardy imagined their discontent for having been taken away from their home. Quote, "We are those whom Christmas overthrew some centuries after Phidias knew how to shape us and bedrape us and to set us in Athena's temple for men's view. Oh, it is sad now we are sold, we gods, for Borean people's gold, and brought to the gloom of this gaunt room, which sunlight shuns, and sweet aurora but enters cold." A better analogy may perhaps be drawn between the circumstances of Assyrian reliefs around the world and that of the caryatid today in the British Museum, who was once a member of a group of such maidens serving as columns on the porch of the Erechtheion on the Acropolis. The contemporary Greek poet Kiki Dimula imagines a love affair between her and the so-called Dionysus from the Parthenon, whom you saw a moment ago on display in the British Museum. So just as their exile could be easier to bear, that is, the love affair is imagined so that their exile would be easier to bear. Dimula writes in her own voice, here an excerpt in English translation by Yanis Hamilakis. "Inside the cold museum room, I stare at the beautiful solitary stolen caryatid, her dark, sweet eyes persistently fixed on Dionysus's body 2 steps away. I suspect a long love affair here which must have brought them together. So when in the evening the room is emptied of the many noisy visitors, I imagine Dionysus leaving his seat, careful not to raise the suspicions of the others, and moving full of energy to overcome caryatid's reservations with wine and caresses. It is possible, however, that I am mistaken. There is perhaps another bond which unites them, more powerful, more painful. In the winter evenings and the beautiful August nights, I see them coming down from their high pedestals and with nostalgic sighs and tears, passionately resurrecting in their memory the Parthenons and Erechtheions which they have lost." In his poem, The Burden of Nineveh, the 19th century painter and poet Dante Gabriel Rossetti brought together references to the famous and canonical classical sculpture in the British Museum, like these, and an Assyrian piece of sculpture then recently discovered known as lamassu, half human and half bull or lion. Such figures guarded portals in the palace of Ashurnasirpal II, as well as other later palaces. At the end of his visit to the Greek galleries in the British Museum, and here you can see a view of the museum's facade today, Rossetti watches a lamassu being brought inside. The latest version of his poem begins thus with Greece. In our museum galleries today, I lingered over the prize dead Greece vouchsafes to living eyes, her art forever in fresh wise, from hour to hour rejoicing me. Sighing, I turned at last to win once more the London dirt and din, and as I made the swing doors spin and issued, they were hoisting a winged beast from Nineveh. A human face the creature wore, and hoofs behind and hoofs before, and flanks with dark runes fretted over. Its wings stood for the light to bathe, such fossil cerements as might swathe the very corpse of Nineveh. The poem is long and complex, and I will only read one other short section which reanimates the sculpture by addressing it directly. Quote, "Now thou, poor God, within this hall, where the blank windows blind the wall from pedestal to pedestal, the kind of light shall on thee fall, which London takes the day to be, while school foundations in the act of holiday, 3 files compact, shall learn to view thee as a fact." And I'm sure he's talking about school groups, like you can see here, often visiting the galleries, who are learning to view the work as a fact. The style of Assyrian sculptures was so different from the Greco-Roman ideal of the time that a lively debate took place in the 19th century as to whether they deserved any space at all in the exhibition halls of the British Museum. Were they beautiful? Did they excite visual pleasure, analogous to the Elgin marbles? I'm showing you the Assyria, or one of the Assyrian galleries in the British Museum today, and the Duveen gallery that you saw earlier. Some objected to their style and execution and found them valuable not as works of art, but only as historical documents. And of course, I'm talking now about this material. On his part, Rossetti underscored the shared fate of Assyrian sculpture, in his words, a relic now of London, not of Nineveh, and of the Elgin marbles, both sets relocated to London, far away from their original context. In the late 20th and early 21st century, celebrating acquisitions that sever antiquities from their environments became unseemly. But the recent horrors that have befallen Iraq and Syria have complicated this assessment and highlighted anew the importance of museums as custodians of world culture. This lamassu stands guard in the Metropolitan Museum, just as the Apkallu of the Worcester Art Museum does, now reminding us of similar works that were recently destroyed and keeping alive an archaeological site that has now almost ceased to exist. This photo of the Northwest Palace was taken in 2008. As you are likely to know, Nimrud was overtaken in 2014 and 2015 by Islamic State fighters who, seeking attention, destroyed monuments maniacally. In this photograph, you see broken reliefs, and in this one, reliefs lie shattered against the walls of the palace. Eventually, ISIS blew up the core of the site. Nimrud was retaken by Iraqi forces in late 2016, and its fate is still evolving. This cartoon likens the obliteration of material culture by Islamic State to the atrocious executions of human beings who cannot be resurrected. Let us hope that no further destruction and looting will occur and that the plan to reconstruct the city with the help of UNESCO and other organizations will materialize, even as the task seems truly formidable. No wonder that we have come increasingly to realize that material objects, including works of art, have lives and deaths, and that their meanings and significance do not only emerge at the moment of their creation. Rather, meanings accumulate over time as objects come variously to interact with new individuals and new groups, up to the point, in some unfortunate cases, of their complete destruction. But even thereafter, objects may continue to live in cultural memory or in copies. So it is all the more encouraging to learn of an Iraqi teenager from Mosul who, in the midst of all this tragedy, is trying to recreate Assyrian artifacts in plaster at his new home in Erbil in Kurdistan. Or to follow the career of the Iraqi-American sculptor Michael Rakowitz, whose Mesopotamia-inspired art recently won the competition for the 4th plinth in London's Trafalgar Square. Since 2003, the 4th plinth has come to feature revolving exhibitions commissioned by the Office of the Mayor of London, and here you can see an earlier commission, Nelson's Ship in a Bottle. Rakowitz's planned work will feature an ISIS-destroyed Lamassu, not from Nimrud, but from Nineveh, which will be remade from recycled Iraqi date syrup cans. The symbolism of the dates, remember the date palm tree we talked about, is quite powerful. Rakowitz's cans, just like some contemporary refugees, made it out from the Middle East following circuitous and eventful routes. Sculptures like the Worcester Apkallu followed equally complicated paths out of Nimrud, the majority in the middle of the 19th century. Acquired at a later time, in 1930, the Worcester relief, as far as we know, did not follow the same trajectory as the majority of Assyrian works today in American museums. In 1931, the Arts magazine reported on the installation of the Worcester relief, explaining that it was, quote, uncovered by native excavators in 1916 and was brought away from Mesopotamia under a British permit in 1922, passing into the possession of a Viennese collector, end quote, to be then imported into the United States in 1930. The journal identifies correctly the origins of the slab in Nimrud and associates it with Ashur-nasir-pal. By contrast, the papers that came with the relief, although referring to the same date of excavation in 1916, assigns the relief to the site of Khorsabad and to the later king, Sargon II, which is clearly wrong. This information, together with the name of the alleged excavator, were likely fabricated. It is difficult to know exactly when and how the relief came to America. Let us now turn to the more typical routes that Assyrian reliefs followed after the discovery of the site of Nimrud. It was in November of 1845 that a young British explorer and antiquarian, Austin Henry Layard, began excavating at the site and quickly discovered the magnificent palace we now call the Northwest Palace, here shown again prior to its recent obliteration. The palace was later understood to have been built by the Assyrian king Ashur-nasir-pal II. Layard found large sculptures very early. You can imagine how difficult it was to move them, as shown in this print, conjuring up the discoveries. In addition to many reliefs depicting rituals like those we have looked at, Layard found narrative scenes showing Ashur-nasir-pal's battles and hunts, his primary duties. You can see here a lion hunt and a battle. Notice the similarity in the position of the human enemy and of the lion. These activities were conducted in order to protect the land, and their depictions proclaimed the king's dominance over both the natural and the human world, serving as a powerful form of propaganda, overwhelming the visitors to the palace, reassuring some and frightening others. These reliefs astonish us with their amazingly detailed depictions of various campaigns against enemies. Note the decapitated body, the various severed heads of enemies, the captives, the loot captured from them, and here, tribute bearers. Layard sent most of the narrative reliefs he uncovered, which were largely unique, to the British Museum, where you can still see them today. And here is the room that I showed you before, one of the Assyrian rooms, and here is one of their installations in the 19th century. Several duplicate reliefs with ritual scenes were released by Layard and his successors to American college-educated missionaries operating in the Middle East under the Ottoman Empire. The missionaries' goal was to proselytize the local populations to the values of their version of Christianity. In this way, Amherst College, Williams College, Middlebury, Yale, Dartmouth, Bowdoin, and other colleges received important works derived from the British excavations at Nimrud. I show you again the group that went to Dartmouth. And here are two from a group at Bowdoin College. Layard offered two slabs, an eagle-headed and a human-headed genie, to Williams College as early as December 1851. Those were the first to go to an American college and the only ones offered to an American institution by Layard himself. Between 1852 and 1860, many more slabs from the Northwest Palace were sent to America by Protestant missionaries. It seems that the missionaries' interest in the Assyrian monuments had partly to do with their perceived religious implications for the historical validity of the Bible. Indeed, the international sensation Layard's discoveries caused was partly due to their demonstration in a general sense that Assyria had existed, and also to an iconography that could be interpreted in light of specific biblical passages. Even so, the interest that such missionaries displayed to the Assyrian monuments excavated in Iraq is a remarkable phenomenon given the hardships and dangers that their work entailed. Several missionaries and their families died at very young ages, struck by illnesses exacerbated by the extreme heat to which they were unaccustomed. Here's a picture of the medical missionary Henry Lobdell, an Amherst graduate who died tragically young while packing up Assyrian reliefs destined for America. Originally a foot thick, the reliefs were typically sewed down to about 3.5 inches or so and cut into manageable sections, carefully wrapped in layers of felt, put in boxes, and then covered with more felt. You can see the evidence of both types of reduction on the Worcester relief. Here the reduction in stone thickness, and here the 9 sections into which the body of the relief was saw cut. When a few years ago the Conservation Department undertook a cleaning and restoration campaign, as you heard earlier, and here I'm showing you the relief before cleaning on the left and almost clean on the right. The question at that time was thoroughly considered whether to mask the cuts and return the surface to its original appearance, or whether to leave them visible and thus highlight the subsequent developments in the relief's biography. In this case, the latter approach prevailed and the cuts are evident. In some cases, heads were cut out of figural reliefs at Nimrud for the sake of convenience, but also perhaps to approximate a modern sense of portraiture, as you can see here in examples now at Harvard and the Metropolitan Museum. There were two main routes that Assyrian artifacts followed in the 19th century on their way out of Iraq. In one, they would travel from Nimrud to Mosul on mules, and from there on camels across the Syrian desert to various ports on the Mediterranean, from where they departed by ship. This print gives you a sense of the work involved. They could float down the Tigris River on rafts, as evoked by this 19th century watercolor, to the Persian Gulf, then traveling away by ship from ports like Bombay. The Assyrians themselves recorded the difficulties of moving large stone sculptures, as on these two sections of a relief in the British Museum, which once decorated the palace of King Sennacherib at the site of Nineveh at the beginning of the 7th century BCE. And I'm not sure you can see here clearly, but there is a lamassu that is being sort of dragged through ropes by a number of people, probably slaves. And you can even see, I can't see it quite well from here, but I know that there are a couple of supervisors on top of the statue that are telling other people what to do. In the 8th and 7th centuries, Assyrian sculptors abandoned the large figural format and the depiction of rituals of the type that the Worcester relief represents, as you can see here. Reliefs were now populated by many smaller figures and with extremely detailed narratives. In fact, the Worcester Art Museum has in its possession a small 7th century fragment, possibly from the palace of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, which shows a groom with horses. You can see it here. I'm showing you now a close-up, and a similarly themed example at the Metropolitan has been attributed to the 8th century King Sargon II and his palace at Khorsabad. As we saw, narrative scenes appeared in Ashurnasirpal's palace as well. Several were concentrated in the throne room, marked B on this plan. You may get a sense by looking at a colorful and imaginary reconstruction of the throne room published by Layard in 1849, a lithograph that is ubiquitous in college teaching, museum displays, and scholarly publications. It shows a perspectival view into another small room. One of the throne room's short walls is depicted in its entirety, interrupted in the middle by a large portal, which is framed by guardian lion lamassu. The narrative scenes on the long walls chart Ashurnasirpal's victories over human enemies and animal adversaries. We have already seen actual reliefs with such scenes. On the lithograph, all surfaces are richly ornamented with polychrome images, while a quote-unquote live Assyrian king and his entourage reenact some of the imagery. This is a very rich image on which a colleague and I devoted a recent study, which explored it holistically, including the rendering of the floor, which is completely carpeted with laboriously executed pseudo-cuneiform inscriptions. Among other things, we were drawn to the extraordinary, almost obsessive effort that went into these illegible pseudo-inscriptions. The magnification that digital technologies enable allowed us to discover some intelligible words in Latin script floating among the nonsensical, extending outward from the king's hem. There is something delightful in their meaning-making potential as they emerge from invisibility into visibility. And so we read over 3 lines, and I hope you can read that. Auspicio senoris bonomi in officio oveni ionesi, Karl Hambuck, F., London, 1848. You can see that, I think, here. The name Hamburg appears a few lines above as Hamburg Planista, as well as twice reversed in the general vicinity. Not only is this text completely hidden within and overwhelmed by the sea of signs, it is also impossible to see without substantial magnification. Surprisingly absent among the names in this hidden signature of sorts is that of Austin Henry Layard, who has been credited with the execution of the lithograph, and who, in his book of 1849, The Monuments of Nineveh, where the lithograph appeared, explained the archaeological evidence behind it. Two of the names, and you can see him here in older age. Two of the names belong to well-known Victorians. Joseph Bonamy, an artist, Egyptologist, and later director of the John Soane Museum in London, and the architect and designer Owen Jones, whose book, The Grammar of Ornament, has been continuously in print since the middle of the 19th century. Both were major players in the controversies on art, culture, and design of their day, but neither was ever publicly acknowledged as a player in Layard's book. At a slightly later time, both Jones and Bonamy, along with Layard, participated in a major effort at highlighting the arts at the Crystal Palace at Sydenham Hill in South London, which you can see here. Among its various examples of manufacture and industry from around the world, the Crystal Palace showcased 10 glamorous fine arts courts, each dedicated to a different period or culture, including one dedicated to Assyria and another to Egypt. Appointed director of decorations, Owen Jones put his fearless aesthetics of color and ornamentation, which earned him the title Color King, at work at Sydenham, inserting polychrome effects in the courts, which attracted widespread criticism, at least initially because of their alleged tastelessness and garishness. In addition to his supervisory role, Jones designed, among others, the Egyptian court, on which he collaborated with Bonamy, while the architectural historian James Ferguson designed the Assyrian court in consultation with Layard, who wrote the official guidebook. The Assyrian court received mixed reviews at the time because of its startling colors. On the lithographic reconstruction, as we saw, Bonamy is credited for oversight or superintendence, auspicio, of the work, while Jones for providing the services of his lithographic studio. In its great polychromy, the lithograph consciously participated in the debates of its time, and already in the late 1840s took an early stance against the so-called classical canon of whiteness. Layard himself believed that the reliefs he had uncovered were either entirely or partly painted, and he noted the finds of blue, red, yellow, black, and white pigments in various media. The scholars and architects who engaged with the Assyrian finds from a professional standpoint largely agreed on the topic of polychromy, but they diverged on the degree of brilliance each was willing to assign, as well as on the question of whether the reliefs were completely or selectively painted. The reconstruction of the throne room is, as we saw, exuberant in its polychromy, which was possible to achieve because of great advances in lithography. In the 19th century, chromolithography was an emergent reproductive technique. The first definitive steps having been taken in Germany in the first half of the 19th century, innovation spread quickly to other European countries, especially England and France, and soon the United States. Artist craftsmen with international ambitions moved as well, sometimes in attempts to flee from the consequences of the revolutions of 1848, and developed highly specialized and sophisticated techniques for all stages of the process, from original drawing or painting to its transference to the lithographic stone to its multi-stage printing. Some pioneer artists were hailed as geniuses in their understanding of drawing on stone, color principles, employment of pigments, preparation of inks and varnishes, and the use of the printing press. It is perhaps within this framework that we can situate the third and most intriguing name concealed within the floor on this masterpiece of chromolithography, Karl Hamburg. The floor inscription, Karl Hamburg, F, London, 1848, stands for Karl Hamburg fecit, Karl Hamburg made this, in London in 1848. We may thus take this as a signature of a lithographic artist whose name, as I mentioned previously, appears 3 other times embedded within the floor. Did anyone other than Hamburg know and approve of his act of self-inscription in Layard's project? Or was his self-commemoration a young man's playful doodle? He was 23 at the time. Or was it a sign of transgressive ambition, a secret challenge to authority, a competitive setting of the record of authorship, however concealed? I regret that I have no time to trace for you the research journey that led us in the footsteps of this unknown but talented German artist. Suffice it to say that he went from Stuttgart in Germany to London, then back to Stuttgart and to the German National Museum in Nuremberg, where he held an important position from which he was, however, eventually dismissed. He was later expelled from Germany in 1874 at the age of 49, most likely in the aftermath of the 1871 law that criminalized homosexuality. He was encouraged to immigrate to America, where he ended up by accident in Richmond, Virginia. There, he had a successful but short-lived career before his collapse and death in a park in 1879. His only painting in a public collection is the farm of Theodore Frick, pork packer, in the American Folk Art Museum in New York, which comes across as a lithographer's neat work. Hamburg inserted not only his signature at the bottom left-hand side corner with date, but also a picture of himself nearby as a gentleman with top hat, as if to claim authorship in 2 different ways. The signature Karl W. Hamburg, 1878, July 8, with its use of periods as separators and the same style as on the Assyrian chromolithograph, establishes beyond doubt that the young lithographer working in London and the mature painter in Richmond are the same person. All those involved with the lithograph must have been right to some extent. The use of color would have undoubtedly greatly enlivened the Assyrian figures, allowing them boldly to stand out in generally dark halls, though we do not know the extent to which paint was employed. The wedge-heeled sandal of the king on the Dartmouth relief shows red and black pigment very clearly. The Worcester relief demands more effort on the viewer's part in this regard, but some traces of red are visible on the left sandal of the genie. Impossible to see with one's eyes are traces of blue on the tassels of the robe. The colors would have further animated the lineup of figures gesturing in perpetuity, stubbornly keeping alive a civilization that ceased to exist thousands of years ago, was resurrected in the 19th century, and is under severe threat again today. Thank you.
Why did they build with brick rather than stone?
So, I can't answer that for sure from their perspective. Certainly it is very easy to find, to make mud brick in the Middle East. The mud brick has been a sort of a long-standing building material. It actually turns out that it can withstand fire much better than stone can, actually. But of course, then it needed some reinforcement in the case of the palace to make it long-lived. This particular palace actually was never set on fire, although it was destroyed, suffered a lot of things over time, but it actually never burned, and which is why the stone reliefs are actually preserved in such a state, because they can get kind of blackened and destroyed that way. But mud brick is a very common building material.
Excuse me, did you say the facades of the sculptures were marble?
You mean the material of the sculpture? It's a gypsum, alabaster. Now I know other people are more knowledgeable than me about the exact differences between alabaster and gypsum, but they're kind of related stones. So that is what it is, and it's a stone that can be fairly easily carved.
And so was it native to the region, and did it have to travel to be used?
In this case, it was native to the region. Northern Mesopotamia, around Mosul, there is an area from where this material can be easily procured.
Maybe just one more question?
Just wondering, one of the imagery similar to Zoroastrianism, it was destroyed in the 7th century by the Medes. Was there any evidence of the Zoroastrians borrowed the wings and some of the imagery?
I guess not in any identical way. I guess Persian art of a little bit later than this has some aspects in a sort of similarity in some sort of very general way, but nothing really terribly specific that would be attributed directly.
How about one final question? One final question. Did you have a question?
Yeah. I wanted to ask, for how long was the palace occupied? And then what was the cause of it not being occupied? And then how long before it was then excavated? Just to give just a very brief history of its occupation.
Well, so it is more or less a one-period building associated with this particular king. However, later successors at some point did come back into the palace, took some of the reliefs. There are some signs that it was also occupied for brief periods of time by later kings. But that is kind of minimal in comparison to its association with this particular king. Each king wanted to make a statement of their own, so you have several Assyrian palaces of successive kings in different parts. Both in, you have Nimrud, you have in Nineveh, you have at Khorsabad, so everybody wanted to make a little bit of their own kind of statement.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.